So then we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant from the Aramaic English translation. And in 2nd Shimon, the second chapter, it states, "But in the world there were many false prophets, and there will likewise be false teachers among you, who will bring in destructive heresies, denying Yahweh that bought them, thus bringing on themselves swift destruction. And many will go after their profane, and their actions of whom the way of truth will be then reproached." So then, Shimon, as we understand, he was a shaliach, and he began also giving some understandings regarding then the later times when then preachers and teachers would teach heresies. We then, from the time that he began to speak these words, Shimon then was endowed also with an anointing of teaching and instructing the people. So then these days we are living in, as we come together and we begin to understand, then we are entering the revelation. It is very imperative for us to understand what is false and then what is truth. And then the way of destruction is always broad, and we were never brought up with the proper understanding of the model of Moshe being then the Holy Land set around the world. We always thought that there was then a building where you go once, and then you would receive some sort of a teaching, and then would resume life as usual, whereas you're never taught, in fact, that there is no judgment to come in heaven, there is no ruling with him in heaven, there is no coming from the dead in a bodily form. So those areas, they became very obscure, and then not very many people can find the truth. But then Shimon, he explains in the later times, then would come then those people involved in teaching heresies. So it's our obligation of searching the scriptures and being very familiar with the Hebraic line of thinking and understanding, because truly in the camps they don't think, they act. The Hebraic understanding is always action and never thinking. But we as Gentiles, we must think through, because we are not from those particular understandings of the line of the Hebrews. So then when we read the areas of then Shimon, we begin to understand what he meant. He is speaking of then prophetic understandings. And then again, every time Shilishim they speak, they always speak in layers. Always in layers and never in flat surface. Flat surface does not bring spiritual prophetic shadow understanding. So then he's making a comparison of what then he was truly teaching the people and instructing them versus those lies in prophetic areas where then people would not understand. So then later he then explains, and they were then raving or giving raving words, they will then be destroyed by such. For if Elohim spared not even those who left their posts, but they did sin, and they cast them down to the infernal regions in chains, and delivered them up to be kept to the judgment of the last days. So this is what it means then. In this particular understanding, he speaks of the judgment of torture. Gives another area where then there is a place of torment until the end of the age. There it is in 2nd Shimon, the second chapter from the original manuscript, states there is a place of torture, or then a place of being tortured in. So then, understanding the later, what he's speaking of is speaking of these teachers speaking heresies and not understanding from the Hebraic line, then they themselves at the end would then be destroyed, as then the angels that left their posts. They were cast down from their posts for the destruction of the last day. So then, rather than being entangled with so many areas of these Greco-Roman understandings that we were brought up in, so then we begin to understand the Hebraic understanding, and then we can be more acquainted of what's coming. Revelation, every area of the speaking and teaching of the Shilishim were somehow related with then the end to come. So when they were then speaking, they were speaking always in layers, as if then you would understand as a stack of morning breakfast having 100 pancakes on your plate. So then, rather than when you were explaining an area, rather than you bite then the 100 pancakes at the same time, you take 4 or 5 and then you bite, and then later you take another 2 and then another 4 and another 6. So it's a kind of understanding there. We'll begin understanding layers when explaining the future. Rather than emptying the mind, the Greco-Romans, they had a very unreliable way of thinking, because they empty their minds. They take step by step, or then a layer at a time, and it doesn't work that way. It never did. So when the Shilishim, they were speaking, they were always speaking in multiple layers at the same time, but then evaluating where they were speaking of, and then taking from the, for instance, first and second, first and fourth, first then and seventh, to complete what they were saying. Those are the understandings from layers then, and from Hebrews. Later on, when then Yohanan was then writing the revelation, or the revelations, he was then in the mainland in a camp, because he had visions and he was not on the island. So then you begin to understand what it means, the many layers of them before Yohanan began the explanation of those areas. Some of them Yohanan was aware of, some of them he was not. When he was then explaining the actual facts of those prophetic shadows of themselves, he was giving details how those would take place. As we understand, for instance, in Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, from the 23rd verse to the 44th verse, that was the actual solid foundation of Revelation. Later there was another layer placed with the practical side, how would these would take place. So then you begin to understand the previous layer, and then at the very end the way this specific layer would then take shape. So it's not very easy understanding, because the Greco-Romans, they did not explain it. They didn't understand themselves. And in fact, they scoundrelized the scriptures so badly because they themselves wanted to be important. Yohanan was not on the island. He was not in a cave writing Revelation. He was in the mainland, protected in a camp. You can't have visions outside of the camp. So then when he was receiving a direct line from heaven of then the practical side of what then the autumn feast would take place, not the original prophetic itself, but then the practical side, how would it take place based upon the foundation spoken of in Leviticus. So then you begin to understand what it means, the many layers that comes from the previous. And when we're speaking of the previous, meaning then the first service. But then those areas, they must be so familiar with, and a person must be so acquainted with the many layers, so then when you speak of a certain prophetic areas, you know precisely what layer or what layers then are pertinent to what you are speaking of. certain areas, when you explain, they are equivalent, or they are then backed up by certain amount of layers. When you change the subject, some of the existing layers they remain, but then the others they take over. Because it must be covered every time from the previous covenant. You can't simply have the previous covenant and then another covenant and not relating with each other. The fact was the Greco-Romans, they made a mistake stating that the Torah then and the prophets and the writings were then abolished. It was the worst mistake they could ever made. Because then the very prophetic layering understanding, it's absolutely lacking. And they made a joke out of themselves. Because what they teach makes no sense. They are teaching purely lies. If you ask them, what do you understand of the prophetic shadows to come? And they can't answer it. Because they made a novel out of the renewed covenant in their own language. They're simply living day by day, until they die straight down then to the first death, torment. And then the Greco-Roman Messiah won't save you. Only those that are from the Messiah, from the Hebraic Messiah, then a person is saved. And then the encouragement of the Hebrew brothers to return to their camps, because those were then the last orders. Much more coming up.